The Rainbow Tower. Written by Alex Tymms. Illustrated by R H Stewart. Episode 37. Red. Jed watched with growing unease as Fox raised his hand and nodded both left and right to make sure everyone was ready. The builders stood in silence. Even the loader was quiet as its electric engine sat at idle. Jed listened hard and frowned. Something wasn't right. There was no telltale swishing of cloaks and no regimented march to the feet. Instead, the footfalls echoing down the corridor appeared random, and he was sure he could hear a low murmuring. This wasn't the sound of the enforcers who had chased him all over the tower. The power loader's bearings whined as Francis stirred the engine into life and crawled forward. Fox raised his hand for him to stop. He didn't want to commit his biggest weapon too early. Jed looked at Fox, then at the loader. Without warning, he dropped the bar he'd been holding and darted forward. "Jed!" Katie hissed. Fox stared as Jed ran down the corridor. As he ran, Jed prayed he was right. He hadn't heard enforcers, had he? He pounded round the corner and almost collided with a man holding a baton over his head. The prod swished down, only just changing course in time before it smashed into him. "Don't you ever do that again!" Graham cursed, looking as though he'd almost suffered heart failure. "We thought you were one of those terrible enforcers," Clarice said as she grabbed Jed and hugged him. Halfway through, she suddenly remembered herself and awkwardly let him go. "We thought the message could be a trap, but we had no choice." "The fact they removed it from the screen suggested it wasn't," Graham said, as if revisiting a well-worn argument. Jed looked behind the two greens. A sea of faces stared back at him, filling the corridor as far as he could see. "Well, we reached here without any trouble. That's what matters," Clarice said. Jed turned back to her. "You mean you haven't had to fight your way here?" "After the battle at the escalators into Red," Graham began. "It was awful," Clarice interjected, her face troubled at the memory. "It's been quiet as a grave. That's why we're so twitchy. We couldn't believe they—" "Jed," came a voice from back round the corner where Fox and the others waited. A whisper came from the crowd like an echo, repeating his name again and again as people passed it back through the crowd. Jed found it disconcerting and looked back to see Katie peering round the corner. "You're okay," she said in amazement. "We all thought—" "I'm fine. Now come on, let's get these people to the bridge." "You mean you did it?" Clarice asked. "Not me," Jed replied. "Fox and the other builders." But his reply was drowned out as the crowd echoed, "He did it!" endlessly back. Jed wanted to shout at them. It wasn't him. He didn't know the first thing about bridge building. Couldn't they see that? Fox and Phillips arrived. "Blimey," the younger brother said, reeling at the number of people arranged in front of them. "There's way more than this," Graham said with a smile. "Then come on, what are you waiting for?" Fox replied. Wide-eyed refugees began filing past, all of them staring at Jed. He tried to ignore them. "What about Silas?" he asked Graham. "Said something about leading from the back, silly ass." "And no sign of enforcers?" Fox asked. Graham shook his head. "Well, it's one big scrap to enter Red. We reckon Swenson must have given up." With that, they were swept along with the crowd. As they walked, Katie jostled to be near Jed, pushing some staring refugees out the way. "Swenson wouldn't just give up," she hissed. "I know he wouldn't." Jed looked round at the people. They were a mix of all colours and all ages. A few indigos, some blues, greens and yellows all mingled together. What he noticed was the absence of orange. Maybe Silas was even now trying to persuade them to leave, or maybe Katie was right. Then a flash of close-cropped blonde hair caught his eye over in the crowd to his left. He ducked and dived to see over the heads in front. There were two, no, three, then two more over there, and, leaning to one side, He could make out Francis in the loader. That made 6 Fox brothers. He looked back to the crowd, trying to spot the blonde head he'd seen moments before. "What is it?" Katie asked, grabbing his arm. "There," Jed replied, at last spying the man again. "It's Fergus." She looked puzzled. "The 7th Fox brother, the one who was an enforcer." As he spoke, Fergus looked towards them. His eyes were still the telltale milky white. "They're in the crowd," Jed hissed, bobbing out the way. "That's why we haven't seen any enforcers. They're in with the refugees. Get to Fox," he said to her urgently. "Warn him." "Well, what are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to try to flush them out. Now go." Jed shoved his way towards Fergus, who was staring forward again while Katie jostled her way to Fox. Coming up behind the big man, Jed now realised why he'd been the one to stay behind. His back and arm muscles rippled under his tight t-shirt as he walked. There was only one way Jed could think of bringing down such a huge opponent. He walked in step behind the man, choosing his moment with care. Just as Fergus transferred his weight from one foot to the other, Jed neatly clipped the man's heel. The giant fell silently forward, shoving people this way and that as he crashed onto the red carpet. "Enforcers to the bridge!" came a shout from just behind Jed. He turned to see a man in an ill-fitting blue coverall over an orange suit bawling the command. All through the refugees, big men shoved and wrestled their way forward, lumbering towards the bridge. Jed strained to see over the heaving crowd, catching a glimpse of Katie talking urgently to Fox. As the builder looked round, his eyes narrowed. Jed opened his mouth to shout at them to hurry, only for nothing to come out. Instead, he'd been grabbed round the throat and lifted off his feet. Vice-like fingers dug into his neck muscles and pressed down on his windpipe as he stared into Fergus's blank eyes. Jed kicked and punched, but the man was impervious to attack. Around him, people panicked and ran, but no one came to his aid. Jed could feel his vision blurring. "Get down!" he vaguely heard someone yell. Was this at him? He couldn't get down. He couldn't do anything. A blinding arc of light filled the corridor. Jed felt his chest explode and he span through the air. Despite the pain in his lungs and throat, he still dragged in air as he sailed over the heads of those around him. He tensed up, preparing to hit the water just like he had in the blue room. Was Trevor in the pool? Jed was confused when he didn't hit water, but cannoned into someone and came sprawling to a stop face down on thick carpet. What was going on? His addled brain tried to make sense of this. Of course, he wasn't in blue, but in red. That's why red filled his vision. His ears, however, were wet, which confused him, and his toes and fingers tingled. Jed was hauled to his feet. A blurry blonde head appeared in front of him. He tried to lift his arms to defend himself, but it was only a token gesture at best. However, he didn't need to. He made out a smile and glasses looking at him. It was Phillips. "Cool," said the young man. "Fergus used to do that to me. Said he was only playing." The stack of batons he was holding smoked slightly. "But he'll never do that to me again. Not now I have this beauty." He gestured to the big man lying flat on his back. Jed felt something trickle from his ear. He touched it, then looked at his hand to find his fingers were red with blood. He'd been electrocuted again. "Ah," Philip said, looking awkwardly at Jed's chest. Smoke was rising from his pocket. Jed pulled out the phone to find the plastic case had melted and the screen cracked. "Sorry, must have hit it full on. Still, better than being dead, eh?" Jed struggled to think. There was something important he had to do. What was it? "The bridge," he croaked. "They're going for the bridge." He looked ahead to see the enforcers had managed to break through the builders, whose defences had been hampered by the presence of so many refugees. Jed ran, his throat hurting as he drew in rasping breaths. If those enforcers managed to destroy the bridge, they were all doomed. Katie and Fox were just ahead of him. He ran to catch up with them, only to have them skid to a halt, staring ahead. Jed followed their gaze, and he too stopped running in disbelief. What had the enforcers done? How could this be? He stared at the bridge. Its deck was bucking and bouncing as if someone had taken one end of it and was shaking it violently up and down. "How?" Katie shouted as they saw an enforcer try to run onto the bridge, only to be thrown off the edge in eerie silence. "It wasn't them," Francis replied, running over to them. "It just started on its own." "What the—" Phillips had joined them. "Well, what's going on?" "It's shaking itself apart," Fox shouted. Thank you very much for listening to The Rainbow Tower. To see more of R H Stewart's excellent artwork, you'll find him on Instagram at roy.hootson.stewart. For Alex Tymms, why not try the novel OutCaste at ao3.com? Or, for something completely different, check out the Amier series on YouTube or at amier.com, also by Alex Tymms. The Rainbow Tower. Text copyright Alex Tymms. Illustrations copyright R H Stewart. The right of Alex Tymms and R H Stewart to be identified as the author and illustrator of this work has been asserted in accordance with the Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988.